Hand a complete beginner a guitar at a jam session and there's one shape that lets them solo for 10 minutes straight and barely play a single wrong note. Not because they suddenly got good overnight, but because the scale they're leaning on has had its two most dangerous notes quietly removed. That scale is the pentatonic, and the name simply means 5 notes per octave instead of the usual 7. 5 notes, spread across the whole keyboard, that somehow seem to agree with almost anything you throw underneath them. It's the sound of 1,000 rock solos, the bones of countless folk tunes, the safety net that every improviser, from a first-week student to a touring professional, reaches for first. Think about that for a moment. Most scales hand you 7 notes and quietly warn you that some of them will bite if you play them at the wrong instant. The pentatonic hands you 5 and lets you wander freely. And the reason it works isn't luck, and it isn't some mysterious gift. It's that, centuries ago, people across completely unconnected cultures all stumbled onto the same idea: take the ordinary major scale and strip out exactly the 2 notes most likely to clash with the music underneath. What's left is almost foolproof. So instead of just telling you that, let's actually do it ourselves, note by note, and watch a scale that's genuinely hard to play wrong appear right in front of you. Start with something you almost certainly already know, the C major scale. 7 notes climbing from C up to the next C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, and then home again. It's a perfectly good scale, the first one nearly everyone learns. But 2 of those 7 notes are quiet troublemakers, and most beginners are never told which. They each sit just a half step away from one of the strong, stable notes around them, and that tiny half-step gap is exactly what makes a melody suddenly sound like it stumbled onto a wrong note. Let's name them. The first troublemaker is the 4th note, F. It sits a single half-step above E, and over the home chord that closeness sounds restless and unresolved, like the note is itching to slide back down. The second troublemaker is the 7th note, B. It sits a half-step below the top C, leaning so hard toward home that it can never quite sit still on its own. Those 2 notes are wonderful when you want tension and pull. They're exactly what makes the major scale feel like it's going somewhere. But they're also the 2 notes a beginner is most likely to land on at the wrong moment and wince. So here's the entire move, and it's dead simple. We take those 2 leaning notes, the F and the B, and we lift them right out of the scale. What's left is C, D, E, G, and A. 5 notes. That is the C major pentatonic scale. And notice exactly what we did. We didn't reach for anything exotic, we didn't add a single new note. We just deleted the 2 notes most likely to fight the chord underneath. The half steps are gone, and with them, most of the ways there ever were to sound wrong. Now for the version you've almost certainly heard the most, because it is the absolute backbone of nearly every blues and rock solo ever played. And here's the lazy, wonderful secret to building it: we don't need any new notes at all. We just borrow the exact same 5 we already found, and start somewhere else. Take C, D, E, G, A, and instead of treating C as home, we make her the home note. The same 5 pitches, simply reordered, give us A, C, D, E, and G. That is the A minor pentatonic scale, and it is the relative minor of the major one, in exactly the same way that A minor is the relative minor of C major. Same notes, completely different center of gravity, and the result is a totally different mood. Where the major pentatonic sounds open and sunny and bright, this one sounds soulful, a little melancholy, the sound of a slow bend on an electric guitar. Watch where the notes fall when we root the keyboard on A. We climb A, then up to C, then D, then E, then G, and finally back to A an octave higher. And look at the spacing, because this is the part that gives it character. 3 of those steps are a tone and a half wide, bigger than any single step inside an ordinary scale. Those wide, confident leaps, with no cramped little half steps in between, are a huge part of why the minor pentatonic sounds so vocal, so expressive, so much like a human voice reaching for a note in a solo. So why exactly does removing 2 notes make a scale this forgiving? The whole answer comes down to one idea: half steps. In a normal 7-note scale, the sharpest, most grating tension comes from 2 notes sitting only a half step apart. Play those 2 at the same time, or land on the wrong one of them over a chord, and your ear immediately hears a clash, that slightly sour rub that instantly tells you something is off. It's the musical equivalent of a typo. Now here's the pentatonic secret, and it's the whole reason it exists: it has no half steps anywhere inside it at all. None. The very closest that any 2 of its notes ever sit to each other is a whole step, which is a noticeably gentler, more agreeable distance, and the rest are wider still. Because there are simply no half-step clashes built into the scale, almost any note you choose to land on already belongs comfortably to the chord underneath, or sits a safe, consonant distance away from it. You quite literally run out of ways to sound truly wrong. Now, to be fair, that doesn't mean every note is equally interesting. You can absolutely still play something dull or aimless inside a pentatonic. But the harsh, obvious, this is clearly out of key collisions, the ones that make a listener flinch, just aren't available to you anymore. You removed the source of them. That's the whole trick, and it's exactly why a 5-note scale can feel less like a cage and far more like a wide-open playground. Once your ear knows this sound, you genuinely start hearing it absolutely everywhere. Pick up an electric guitar and the minor pentatonic is, without exaggeration, the very first scale almost anyone learns. It's the ladder underneath solos by everyone from old Delta blues players to the biggest stadium rock bands on earth. It's the move under a screaming, sustained bend, and it's the riff you find yourself humming on the walk home from a gig. Switch to acoustic, and folk music leans on the major pentatonic constantly, which is a big part of why so many traditional tunes feel timeless, open, and somehow ancient, and why melodies built from it travel so easily from one country and one culture to the next. And listen for it in pop too, especially in the hooks. The catchiest top-line melodies, the ones an entire stadium can sing back word for word, very often live entirely inside these same 5 notes, precisely because notes with no half steps between them are so easy to sing accurately and so hard to get wrong. Here's a fun one to test at home: the 5 black keys on a piano, taken all together, spell out a pentatonic scale all by themselves. That is the reason a small child can mash only the black keys, hit them in any order at all, and it somehow always comes out sounding vaguely musical rather than chaotic. Once your ear is properly tuned to it, the pentatonic turns up in far more of the songs you already love than you would ever have guessed. So that, in the end, is the real gift of the pentatonic. You take the familiar 7-note major scale, you lift out the 2 notes most likely to clash, and you're left with 5 that lean on one another comfortably instead of fighting. Start that same handful of notes on C and you get the bright, sunny major pentatonic. Start the very same notes on A and you get the soulful, aching minor one. No half steps anywhere inside, so the harsh collisions simply aren't there to trip you up, and that is exactly why it's the first scale ever handed to a nervous beginner and, at the same time, the last scale a true master ever stops reaching for. 5 notes, and almost endless freedom inside them. But there's one last piece. There is one more note, a note we very deliberately left on the cutting room floor a few minutes ago. It's a flattened, growling, in-between pitch that doesn't quite belong to any normal scale at all, a note that sounds almost wrong on purpose. Drop that single note back into the minor pentatonic, in just the right spot, and the whole scale stops sounding merely pleasant and safe, and suddenly starts sounding like the blues. That one note, and where it hides, is exactly where we're headed next.